Welcome back to another episode of the Dynasty Dingers podcast. It is our first episode of the new year, going into 2025. Today, we have a very special guest from the ToolShed podcast. Eric Cross is going to join us. We are splitting this episode into two different podcast episodes for you. Went a little long. We were about 2 hours. So, first episode is going to give you an opportunity to get to know Eric a little bit more, dive into how he got into the industry, what he's currently doing, some of the looks and dives into how he evaluates players. But before we bring Eric in, I want to say what's up to Doc.
What's up, bro? It's a new year. It's a new me. I got the microphone back. I got the good mic, so you can actually hear all the important things I have to say. And I got a haircut. Psh, that's not just the headphones, man. It's a new year, new me. We're getting serious around here. Dynasty Dingers.
Yes, and as we get more serious, as Doc mentioned, we're going to start working on some of the audio quality. We know that a few of you had commented and want a little bit boost in the volume, so keep commenting. Let us know how we have been doing on that end. And big year for us here in 2025. Lots changing with STS, and lots changing with the way we're doing shows. As we've had some great guests on, we intend to continue that as the year continues. But let's welcome in Eric Cross of the ToolShed podcast. Eric, what is going on?
Not much. How you guys doing?
We're doing all right. We are in the middle of, I think, what one FYPD, Doc? Is it two that we're doing right now?
FYPDs? Bro, I mean, we're about to start up two 30-team leagues for Scout the Statliners, and man, it's I'm ready to roll with that. I just feel like we're doing a free agency fest. Like, okay, we're doing salary cap free agent bids. This is on a Discord, but we have like these crazy commissioners. Two insane. I love them to death. I don't know how they're doing it. Basically, we have 80 open bids right now, folks. It's just literally whoever wants a player, you got to bid on them, and 24 hours has to go by. So you have villains in a 30-team league. You have villains who are going to wait till the 23rd hour. Anyway, that's what I'm doing right now. I'm happy to have Eric on, though, man. He's kind of a unit. I'm curious. I want to talk about leagues later with him, too, like how many leagues he's in.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's just kind of dive right into it. We have a number of questions for you today, Eric, but they can kind of kick it off for us. Like, now that you've been in the space for quite a while, how active are you still within the actual fantasy leagues of this hobby?
Man, my number of leagues really fluctuates year to year. I mean, I've had to cut back recently as I wanted this, I was having a hard time saying no. Like, oh, hey, you want to be in this league? Oh, yeah, of course. Is I love it. That's, reason why I got into doing content, or one of the reasons why I loved playing the game, and I loved playing different formats, redraft, dynasty, keeper, etc. So I think right now I'm in, obviously redraft, we're still kind of ramping that up. For dynasty or keeper leagues, I'm in, I think, 5 right now, including my home keeper league, which is the one that kind of kicked it off for me back in sophomore year of high school back in the day. We're now in the year number, I'm gonna make myself feel old, 19 now. So
Yeah.
I mean, first 2 picks of that draft were A-Rod and Pujols, so that back in the day. So I think 5 dynasty right now, maybe starting up a 6th one eventually, and then I'll probably do handful of redraft. Obviously, all the TGFBIs, and I'm in tout and all that stuff, labor, and I'll do some best ball stuff like that. I like to mix it up. I love a lot of different formats. I just love playing, love drafting.
What do you prefer? Do you prefer the dynasty aspect and that competitiveness, or do you feel like it's equal to redraft and some of those higher stakes leagues?
I definitely prefer dynasty. I mean, I love redraft as well. Don't get me wrong, but I've always had that itch to just do stuff year round. And I was like, well, I want to make a trade in November, or something like that. I want to have an offseason draft in December or January. I don't want to wait till like February and start fresh. I think that the reason why we started my home keeper league, we actually just did a redraft league to start. That's how it started. But middle of the year, I was like, man, I like this team a lot. Like, I want these guys again, next year, at least, a handful of them. So that's why I proposed to my buddies. I was like, hey, let's just make it a keeper league and keep, I don't forget what we did for that first year, keep whatever number of players. And the rest is history. But yeah, I do definitely, lean more towards the dynasty side, just because you get that year round. You're always looking to the future, try to win now, but, at what cost for the future? It's adds that extra dynamic, which I think is just really, really exciting. I think it's just the closest thing we have, us normal people to being, the GM or the president of baseball operations of a major league team. So yeah, dynasty, I think, is definitely my true love.
Well, Doc, I want you to chime in on with Eric on this one too. But I was thinking last night because Eric, my story is a little similar. It wasn't sophomore year of high school though. For us, it was sophomore year of college. We got our home league started. So I'm at either year 13 or 14. Same thing at this point. Why count? And I came in as the baseball guy, right? Like I've loved baseball my whole life. I had the Baseball America almanacs at 7 and 8 that I was getting for Christmas. So I had an immediate leg up on my buddies, who in most other aspects of life had a leg up on me. So this was my like shining prize. And after about year 2 or 3, my buddies fell in love with it as much as I did. And now here we are in 2025, where it's a very competitive home league where I didn't really anticipate it ever having the same kind of competitiveness from my friends. But I wanted to know, I guess, from you and from you too, Doc, like, have you seen your friends as well take to that competitive spirit and kind of brush up on their knowledge to the point where it's almost annoying?
Yeah, no, they definitely have, and it's funny now that I'm doing what I do, my friends will use my own rankings against me. Like, I'm the commissioner of that home league, and we had our keeper date not too long ago, and one of my buddies who was the last one to submit his was like, "Hold on," and we have like a Facebook group that we chat and talk shit on, but he was like, "Hold on, I'm waiting for Eric to drop his new dynasty rankings before I make my decisions." It's like, and use against me in trade talks is fun, but yeah, no, to answer your question though. Yeah, I think definitely it was more casual back in the day, but it's gotten harder. Like I used to be able to sneak some prospects by that were bigger name prospects just because a lot of other people just weren't super into the prospect part of it, and now that they are, as they realize, oh hey, this is a big part of winning. You got to make sure you can get the next big guys before they become big names, and so yeah, it's definitely gotten a lot harder to sneak those names by, especially if I'm well, they're like, well, Eric has chased a ladder ranked 11th, so he must really like him. So it's, stuff like that gets used against me. But yeah, it's definitely gotten more and more competitive over the years for sure.
Doc, I know that I'm at least in one league that you would consider a home-esque league, but I know that you have a long-term running home league. Have you had similar experiences to Eric and I?
Well, those guys are goons, man. I was born and raised in Canada. These guys are total hosers, bud. Yeah, that was been around since like 2013. I've been playing since like 2005. But yeah, that one was been since 2013. I remember Freddie Freeman, Paul Goldschmidt were my core. They are still on the roster. They I'm not sure if I still want. I wasn't sure if I wanted Goldie still on there, but Yankees will play it through. Point being, they do something funny. Well, sometimes they'll get mad when my rankings come out. They're like, "Oh, you're just putting your guys higher." I'm like, "Well, yeah, this is my only league, man." No, it's like if I'm not rostering the prospects I like best, it's like a 12
Right.
team Yahoo league. It's old, so we're just doing what we can. So of course I'm just gonna stack like what guys who are in my top 30 if I can, as much as possible. But yeah, so it gets a little fiery, I guess. What I've had to do with them is, if anyone's played on Yahoo, it's no fan tracks. But as I've gotten more addicted to Dynasty and these deeper leagues, I've stretched Yahoo basically to its capabilities. We have the full 10 NA slots, and then I have this whole thing going on a spreadsheet. It's pretty much a hassle, but I'm basically forcing the league to get into the prospect game. And I guess I'd ask you this, Eric. Do you ever find it's like I know that you're big on prospects like us. It's so much fun trying to find that next guy. Do you find it's like you got to kind of remind yourself, we have to get out of prospect mindedness and get into competition. Otherwise you can get tempted to just, oh, shiny new toy. That's, I know I personally can get with that, especially with an FYPD. Like a year ago, I'm like, who are these guys? Today I'm like, oh, Nick Kurtz, Weatherholt, I want them all. Griffin, like,
Yep.
yeah.
No, 100%. And I love that you use the phrase "shiny new toy" because I used that in my first ever article I wrote, which was about Austin Meadows back when he was a top prospect in the Pirates org. This would have been back spring 2017. Everyone has that shiny new toy syndrome. I mean, it's natural. You want to get the next big thing, and I get it. But especially like you mentioned, like the 12 team Yahoo. Yeah, it's good to get some prospects for sure, but you got to realize that you still got to try to win. And somebody, Nick Kurtz, love him. He's gonna be probably one of the better first basemen in the game for a long time, but he ain't gonna help you this year. And if he does, it's for a cup of coffee maybe in August, September. So you gotta always keep your eye on the prize, and that's why I love it because it's such that delicate blend in Dynasty. Like, all right, looking for now and looking for the future. It can be tough sometimes, and I've gone way on both ends of those spectrums, and it's hurt me, and it's also helped me. So, but that's what makes it so fun. But yeah, you definitely have to remind yourself, all right, I don't need another low A prospect. I gotta get maybe a solid role player type for my major league squad just to help me with depth this year or something like that. Like I gotta go out and get me a Tommy Edman instead of going out and getting another prospect. So yeah, it's definitely something you gotta always keep in mind for sure.
I think that's interesting, Eric. And I've seen Doc do this in the leagues that I'm I'm playing in with him, but the shiny new toy syndrome does really affect competitiveness at times, and also plays into what you were talking about with your rankings, where I think, and I will preach this always, it is league specific, right? When you're looking at an FYPD or a free agent class in a dynasty, I was talking to one of my good buddies today who his only hole in a dynasty and only player not under 25 is his infield position. And he was kind of spitting back and forth going with Kurtz or Jesus Made in an FYPD that's coming up. There are some dynamics as to why Made is going to be in this class as opposed to last year, but he really wants to take Made. And the conversation just came down to, you have Made ranked higher, being my buddy, but you need Kurtz. Madi doesn't facilitate what you're looking for. He is incredibly shiny, incredibly high risk. But when you look at what actually needs to be done for this specific team, even the individual at times cannot go by their own rankings, which I think makes it very difficult for our audiences at times, because we are going to, contradict what we're really putting on paper, but it's because there's an actual team need. And I do think sometimes the industry has a hard time with that, because I guess I'll ask you this, do you believe that the rankings and maybe the visibility of those rankings are overinflated at times?
I think they can be, because I've had to do that same thing that you just mentioned. My example, I remember recently last year, I had a contending dynasty league team and wanted to get some more pitching. My pitching had fallen apart and didn't plan out as I hoped. So instead of, and I had an FYPD pick. It was like late top 10, like eight or nine, I think it was, and I ended up going with Rhett Lauder. Like, all right, Rhett Lauder. I have a couple of these other lower the high school bats ranked higher than him. I think I probably had him ranked 11 or 12, if I recall correctly. But I'm like, all right, I need pitching, and he's to be up a lot sooner than these high school bats are, probably by 2 or 3 years at least. So yeah, you definitely have to look at your team, or your contention window, your league format. Obviously, you can play it a little differently in a 20 teamer than a 12 teamer. There's different dynamics of that, but yeah, sometimes you have to stray away from your rankings, and I'll get asked like, oh, why don't you take this person instead of this person? You have that one ranked higher. Like, well, I don't need that position. I mean, I might like that player a little more long term, but maybe they're a few more years away, and I don't want to wait for that. Or I need a shortstop as opposed to an outfielder, or whatever it may be. So yeah, I mean, rankings are great, but sometimes you gotta get away from the rankings and look at what your team actually needs. I mean, I don't go crazy and take a guy rank like 50 spots lower or something like that, but you can go a little bit lower in your rankings if you get a position you need.
Doc, do you feel like you follow that sentiment when you're drafting?
I try to go value over everything, and that's why it was so hard for me in this 30 teamer that we're in the salary cap one. I have Quinn Matthews ranked, I don't know, maybe higher than anyone. I just love how he's been able to not only put on velocity but sustain it, and not even just sustain it, but put on an incredible amount of innings. It's like it's the opposite of what your concern would be. It's a complete success, and I feel like we're almost not giving him this credit. Like, he did 156 pitches in a game in college, and he's a lefty, and he's got other pitches too, by the way. Like, he's got like a good starters mix. So I have him ranked, I think, number 11, something like that, out of the non-debuted. Super high. My stacked pitching rotation has room for anyone has room for Quinn Matthews, in my opinion. My shortstop is Trey Turner, and then there's like nobody. And I'm looking here. I got Quinn Matthews at the 10th FYBD pick there, because just, again, league context. Or Connor Griffin. Now it's even like, we don't even know if he's going to stick at shortstop, but the Pirates have said he's a shortstop until he's not. Connor Griffin, in my opinion, has the biggest upside in this draft. And FYPD prep guys are the toughest to rank in your overall, in my opinion, because there's just nothing to really go off of in terms of, pro data or even close to pro data. It's just like, oh, he stole 100 bases in 20 games. You're like, okay, well, I don't think that's going to translate. But yeah, the kids, he honestly did something like that. It was like 87 in 30 games, I think.
Yeah,
but
it was insane. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's like, it's not like he's like this 5'5" guy, or, skinny kid. He's 6'4", putting on muscle, and I'm just sitting here and I'm like, goodness gracious, man. I just feel like Connor Griffin. I had him ranked, I think, 29th or 30th out of non-debuts. That's what you're talking about. Like, it's not 50 spots apart, but that 20 slot window.
Yeah.
It's like, in this situation, is it crazy? Is it crazy to think that Griffin could show enough to be a top 10 guy like a Walker Jenkins or a Max Clark, in my opinion, by this time next year? No, I don't think it's crazy at all. So in those situations, I think go after. But to answer your question, this is a very political answer. I went all the way around for it, but I would say that I really hate going against my rankings. I try my best to not do it, but sometimes your team needs it, and be smart.
Yeah, and Eric, that kind of blends into one of the questions we had for you today. So I'm going to kind of jump around in the outline here, but we wanted to ask you what you look for when you're evaluating players. I know that your partner on ToolShed, Chris Glegg, we had a conversation with him a couple of weeks ago. He's really at the ballparks. He's looking at it from more of a scouting perspective. But I wanted to know what you're looking for when you're evaluating these guys. Is it this stat line? Is it body type? Are you blending analytics as well as old school scouting? Are you at the ballparks? And then lastly, Doc mentioned how hard it is to evaluate these prep players out of the draft into FYPDs. What are you looking for out of those guys?
No, it 100. I'll start there. It 100% is, and I think even more so with like the international guys, right? Like even the top ones. Like, all right, you're getting film from a backfield in Dominican Republic or whatever country they're from. It's like you don't have game data. I mean, there are some scouts go down. They're not like a ton, so it's really hard. And we've seen how it can be so much of a crapshoot. And the one example I always look at was I think it was 2019, the Jason Dominguez year. I think for the most part, it was, Jason was the dude in that class. And, so far, I mean, he hasn't really done much in the majors yet, but you can say that that's still worked out. He became one of the top prospects in baseball. But then for most people I recall, the number 2 and 3 for that class, and I was included in this, were Eric Pena from the Kansas City Royals and Robert Poisson from the whatever you want to call them now, Athletics. And those two have not worked out. And then you see guys like Jackson Churio, who was a decent prospect in his class, but he wasn't like one of the top 5-10 names. And then now obviously he's one of the best young players in baseball. So it's really hard. So something I look for, frame. I mean, it's a lot of things. It's not like A, B, and C. I could list off 7, 8, 9 things here. But I try to blend a lot of things. I mean, I find value in a lot of different aspects of player evaluation, and I think you can be successful with a lot of different. It's not cookie cutter. It's not cut and dry. It's not one way to analyze a prospect. You can look at some stats. It's hard to look at like DSL stats because like oh, that guy just stole 42 bags and walked more than he struck out in the DSL. Well, DSL pitchers and catchers are pretty terrible. So it's hard to take all that with a grain of salt. But you look at one thing you can always look at is approach for both hitters and pitchers. Like if a pitcher's already walking a ton of guys in the low minors, yeah, can that be corrected? Absolutely. But that's already like, all right, that's a bit of a red flag. I'm a little hesitant to go there. Or if a young hitter's already striking out near 30% of the time in the complex level or in DSL, all right, and pitching's not even that good down there, so that's a concern. But it is a lot of different things. I'm at the ballpark a lot as well. Not quite as much as my buddy Clegg, because he's got a lot more ballparks around him.
Yeah, I was gonna say Maine. You're in Maine, right, or somewhere up there?
Yeah, I'm 15 minutes from Portland, Maine, so I got some AA around me, but I don't have like the nearest AAA for me would be 3-hour drive into Massachusetts. Nearest single A is, oh Lord, I I want to say Hudson Valley, New York.
Okay.
I feel like it's 6-hour drive or something like that. So it used to be a team in Vermont, the low A for Oakland, the Athletics back in the day. But they got those one of the teams that got cut a handful of years ago. So yeah, don't quite have as many ballparks around me that Chris Clegg does. But I try to get to the fields a lot, and whenever I travel, I like, all right, where's how can I get to a ballpark or two when I'm visiting family in Virginia or visiting my buddies down outside of Philadelphia, something like that. So yeah, I try to, and I watch a lot of video too. So so I try to watch a lot of video. Do what I can at the ballpark as well. And dig in some of the data and metrics that I have access to. So yeah, it's kind of a long-winded way of saying it's a big old. It's like the punch bowl. It's a lot of different flavors that go into my analysis, but I'm always trying to improve. Even now, I'm still hungry to keep getting better and better, and honing my craft and getting better at my analysis. And if I find a new way to help that, whether it be something analytical or something, the eye test, I'm always going to get better. So yeah, it's a lot of different ways to evaluate prospects these days. So we obviously, you guys know, we have so much, data and tools and, this and that at our advantage. You can do it a lot of different ways, which is really the fun part of it too.
Well, I think that plays into the conversations Doc and I have had over the last year, and it goes right back into league context, right?
Yep.
If you're in a 12-man, you're probably evaluating that roster from a more high-end perspective and potential. You may like the Ellie profile, the James Wood profile when he was in AA more than you like the Caleb Durbin, Jet Williams profile. But if you're in a 30-man, you're going to actually value the Jet Williams, Caleb Durbin profile as potential infielders, potential utility man, where you have to then take that scouting approach into the equation. So it absolutely is a blend, and it also is league to league specific, at least from what I've found. Now, Doc,
Cross. What are we? I'm calling you Cross now. We're bros. Durbin or Jet Williams? Pick one. Go.
I mean,
keep forever.
I'll go Jet Williams.
Okay.
But I will say Caleb Durbin's fun. Mm-hmm. I'm not quite sure how the power plays with Durbin. I think that's kind of like the X factor with him. How much power does he get to? But saw him out in Arizona. I mean, he ran wild. He set the league record by a healthy margin in stolen bases. He can play over the field. I mean, those are, especially like we mentioned the league context, those deeper formats. You need Caleb Durbins on your team. In Milwaukee, even major league teams need guys like Caleb Durbin on their team. So yeah, I do think Jet will provide more value, but I like Durbin too. He was a really fun player to watch. He was just hitting line drives all over the field, playing second, third, short. I think he put a little bit of outfield too. Obviously, running wild on the bases. He definitely is a fun player too.
Do you think Doc and I broke down Jet last week for the Scout the Stat Line 1 through 10 second baseman? I want to say Jet came in at 6 or 7 via the model, the metrics, right? Mm-hmm. Had an injured year, so there was a lot to play into his performance. But Doc had brought up a really good point that the power that we saw in 2023 didn't seem to be there before the injury, and the concern is if Jet Williams loses that power, if he can't be a 10 home run per year major league player, he's going to really have to lean on the speed. Do you think the profile that the industry originally had for Jet may have been a little too aggressive?
Well, just to get in there, I want to rephrase that because I think the industry was expecting 15 to 20, and now we're maybe concerned he's like 10, maybe 15.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, and I always thought that he was more in the 10-15 range anyway. I've seen him two different times now in AA and out in the Arizona Fall League. And actually, he had a massive home run out in the Arizona Fall League. It was probably, if I had to guess, I think it was like 425, 430 to left center. Really majestic shot. It was fun to see. But yeah, I always kind of wondered if he was really only more sort of like the low 10s range, 10 to 13. Maybe he gets up a few years, 15, 16. But I never really saw him, and I saw him before he was injured too. So in 2023, I never saw 15 to 20. I mean, again, maybe 15 some years, but I never was like, oh, this guy's hitting 20. But he does a lot of other things that impact the game. Obviously, he gets on base at an elite clip. He was one of, I think it was 3 or 4 teenagers last year, 2023, to had more than 100 walks. Obviously, he can run a bunch as well. So he can impact the game in a lot of different ways. But yeah, he looks a lot better as a 15 homer guy than a 7 or 8 homer guy. That might not seem like a massive difference, but it really is. It's the difference between like, I don't know why I'm thinking of these two guys, but like Carl Crawford and Michael Bourne, like Crawford was at least getting up in the mid to upper teens when he was, peak value back in the Tampa Bay Devil Ray days. But Michael Bourne, you're like, all right, he hits for a decent average and steals bags, but he's not really giving me any power. So yeah, it might seem like a small number, but I think that's really kind of what I'm talking about with Durbin. Is Durbin a 6-7 home run guy, or can Durbin get to 15, 16? That's kind of the X factor with a lot of these types of players that are more, get on base and steal bags first over the power. But yeah, I do think, again, I thought this beforehand. Jets probably more like a low 10 to 15 homer guy, but I think he can get there. There is sneaky pop in there. He can turn on it, so I think he can get there.
We just, if anyone was doubting that we actually played fantasy baseball for 20 years, Michael Bourne, Carl Crawford, dude, we're in an era where his son, Carl Crawford's son, is now in the game.
I know. It makes me feel so old, especially when the AA for Toronto, New Hampshire Fisher Cats a handful of years ago, when they had Vladimir Guerrero Jr., obviously son of Vladimir Guerrero Sr., they had Bo Bichette, son of Dante Bichette, and they had Kevin Biggio there, and also Lourdes Gurriel too. But Kevin Biggio's son of Craig Biggio. I'm like, man, I grew up watching these guys. I had some of these guys on fantasy teams. Now I'm ranking their sons as prospects. And even like some of my Red Sox fandom, like David Ortiz's son is like getting ready to, he's like 16, 17 playing ball. And it's like, it makes me feel, and I'm not like even that old. Like I'm 34, but the fact that some of these guys that I watched and drafted back in the day are now having their sons that are either already in the majors or about to get there. It's like, man, what happened to the last 20 years?
Well, and that's, I think, a great kind of pivot into another conversation we wanted to have, because we're all in the same age range. We've been fans for a long time, and that's just the natural progression of life. But Doc and I were really curious. You had mentioned earlier your first article from 2017. What got you from the fan base, right? The fantasy player, the guy that likes baseball, into, hey, I may want to write, I may want to create content. What did that journey look like for you?
Yeah, so I'd always kind of thought about it. I mean, obviously, again, I've been playing for such a long time, and I always loved writing too. That was one of my strengths going through school back in the day. So I loved writing, loved stats and baseball in general. So I always knew I kind of wanted to do that. Didn't really. I always had it on the back burner. I'll look into that next season. I'll look into that next season. Then finally, one of my buddies sent me an email because fan started that fan track. So that's the first place I wrote, and they sent out an email to all their users that they like, hey, we are looking to get a content site up to kind of complement our playing platform. And my buddy had played. I actually had not played on Fantrax at that time. I hadn't really heard of Fantrax at that time. But my buddy had played in I'd say it was like a fantasy EPL soccer league or something like that on Fantrax. And he's like, hey, I know, we talked about this the other week. And you've been looking to get into it. He forwarded me the email. Maybe you should apply. So I did. Sent in the article. That was my test article or whatever you want to call it, the Austin Meadows one. And they liked me and brought me on board. And then here we are 8 years later or whatever it is now. So so started with Fantrax. So I was there for how long was I there for? 6 years, and I'm with Roto Baller, FTN. Obviously do the podcast on my Patreon as well. I never thought I'd get to where I would. I never thought I'd even be doing this for 8 years. So that's like, oh, this would be a fun little side thing. And then if it turns into something great, and luckily I love it as much as I did on day one. I still love writing. I still love podcasting. Digging into stats. I mean, that's all we used to do. Me and my buddies. High school study halls, go to the computer lab and was look at box scores and then look on Baseball Reference and whatnot and Fangraphs. That's all we used to do. So and I was always good at math too, so that was kind of a natural fit. Stats and baseball, or it's like a match made in heaven in my brain. So yeah, started then in 2017, Fantrax, and here we are.
Doc and I, we have growing families. I know we kind of talked about this with Chris too. But I think a really big piece I wanted to ask you, with you being, in the content creation space and being a writer and a contributor for 8 years, how do you find the balance with also having a family, having, financial responsibilities as a professional as well to continue doing this for 8 years and moving forward?
Yeah, that's a really tough balance to find. I think a lot of people struggle with it, and I did as well. Because I didn't want to, as much as I loved it, I didn't want it to take away from my time with my children, because I know, like, my kids are already, I have a 12-year-old daughter, 13 this summer, and my son literally just turned 9 yesterday. So it's like, man, like, they're already like 12 and a half and 9. Before I know it, you'll blink again, they'll be 18 and 15. So I didn't want to, like, miss out on all those memories with them, and even just having dinner with them, talking about how school went during the day. So luckily for me, this doesn't work for everybody else, but I'm one of those crazy, like, 4-hour a night sleepers. Like, I don't sleep much. I usually go to bed 1, 2 a.m. and I'm up at 6 a.m. getting my kids ready for school and getting myself ready to go to work. So luckily, my son goes to bed around 8. My daughter, she's 12, so she goes into her room and talks with her friends. So usually after I put my son to bed, that's when I start doing, writing, podcasting, whatnot, and obviously on the weekends more so when we have more free time. But yeah, so luckily that helps. So mostly late nights. Stuff does blend over sometimes. If I have a deadline, I have to do something for an hour, and then they understand that. But I always make sure that, all right, family comes first, and then once family time is done, then right, it's almost like when you were a kid, like, and your parents would tell you, oh, you can't play video games so you get your homework done. That's kind of like my mindset. I can't do my baseball stuff until I do my family time stuff. And families, that's why I put father first in my Twitter bio. That's above everything else. My best thing I've done with my life is become a father to my 2 kids, and I make sure that that always comes first, because they're gonna remember when you're spending time with them, when you're even just like, reading a book with them, watching a movie with them, playing a board game, going out and doing whatever. They're not going to remember the night that, you were working late or you had to do this. They're not going to remember that. So I try to keep that in mind. So something I heard like a long time ago that I always keep in the back of my mind, that, what are they going to remember, you know, 15, 20 years down the road. So it was a hard balance to find, and it takes a while. I know everyone's life situation is different, so that might not work for others, but people that need more than 4 hours of sleep, the people that aren't crazy like myself. But yeah, that's kind of something I've finally been able to find that good groove several years later.
Yeah, I mean, kudos to you. That's very inspirational. I think morally driven too. Something that Doc and I really look for in life in general is just, where's that moral compass? Where are the priorities? Because it's easy to get caught up. And it's easy to, I think you said it perfectly, spend one night where you're focused on getting your rankings out, because heaven forbid your following base doesn't have the rankings tomorrow as opposed to the day that follows. And the next thing you know, 2-3 years have gone by where you've prioritized that over that time. And Doc, you have a growing family. How do you think you've done over the last year with us doing this? I think you've done pretty good, but I wanted to just hear your experience and maybe some of the struggles you've had.
I'm Doc Holiday Dinah. This was supposed to be a burner account where I just said stupid things and like had my thoughts. And then for some reason people started listening to those thoughts. And I'm like, oh gosh, now I gotta like take this kind of seriously. And like, things have snowballed a little bit. Yeah, so I think that was great. What kind of baseball podcast has this kind of heart? Yeah, that was great, Eric. That was great stuff you said there. And I think it's no, but really, and I mean, I think it's a generalization, but a lot of maybe the boomer parents in general, maybe for me at least, I think that fathers in the past were like, hey, I got the money, I provided for you, which is no small feat, but I provided, I'm good. Whereas like I'm looking at my family and I'm like you, Eric, where I'm like, yes, of course I want to provide, but also what will they remember? I want to be there with them every step of the way. And so, yeah, definitely, man, it's been hard because I've been ramping up. I basically started, I think last year was my first real full year, just like having people care about my tweets, and then started writing articles and doing podcasts. And this was it was so much fun. And frankly, here's the deal though. It's like, I was already spending a lot of time in fantasy land and baseball fantasy. So I'm like, my thought in terms of getting into writing and maybe podcasting was just, I'm already spending a ton of time on this anyway. I'll just put it out there and see what happens. And I guess if we want to put it to that, put it out there to people who are maybe thinking about writing, thinking about podcasting, it's easy to say there's enough podcasts, there's enough fantasy, there's enough this. Hey, if you want to try it, just go and do it. Don't overthink it too much, bro. And also if you're in your early 20s, like, I don't know if everyone I know everyone has noticed threads on Twitter, on X. It's like a thread, and it's like so much, bro. And I have my inner hater says stop with the threads, but also I respect it because it's like it takes work. I'm like,
Right.
you're in your 20s or you're a single guy, go and do it because clearly the algorithm loves it, and I think that's as long as there's actual substance behind it, that's great. And so yeah, my advice would be to go out there and do it now, because when you have a family, the family will come first, and it's better. The family is definitely better, and yeah, it's so great. And we get to have conversations now with guys like Eric and Chris, and we'll see what happens in the future. But yeah, it's all about finding that balance, and also just winning dynasty championships. Obviously very important too.
Well, it's funny, Eric, you had mentioned kind of the time frame that you started, and it kind of lines up with your son being around 1, if I'm correct. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah,
He was about 14 months old when I did my first article. Yep.
and so there's always, I think it goes right into like there's never a good time, right? Like, Doc and I have youngsters, and for those that are anticipating or maybe want to jump into the space, you can always make an excuse as to, my time needs to be here or there. But the reality is, it is just about finding that balance that you spoke on. And I think, Doc, you brought up a really good point about threads and X. I wanted to ask you about this, Eric. You and Chris do such an incredible job with your show. I think that goes right into the content space, and also not trying to be other people. Doc and I don't try to be you and Chris. Like we can't. We try to do our own thing, and I think other people in the industry sometimes get caught up trying to be competitive or following other approaches. But you guys have the gold standard for the dynasty format and the way you break down players and host your show and go about that. But the real question I have for you is the growth that you saw on Twitter and sending out tweets. Like, that's how I came across you guys, was that exposure and the work that you put in to give free content to prospective clients or listeners, and really grow your brand. How do you feel social media amplified your ability in the space to grow?
I think it was huge. Like, I don't think I'd be where I am without social media, because I think people, it's a hard thing to realize or accept that you're not gonna, for the most part, and there's exceptions, but you're not gonna get huge right away. You're not gonna be all of a sudden you go from not writing to writing for a huge site. Like, that's really, this doesn't happen. You have to have that slow grind over, maybe it's only a year, maybe it's 2, 3, 4 years, but you have to put out some free content. Like, that's what I was trying to do. Something I tell young writers is that get your stuff out there, whether it's your a tweet that's just analysis of a player, or like, hey, this is my thoughts on this or whatever, or if in an article or podcast format, get your content, whatever that is, out there, because you're not going to grow if no one sees what you're doing, right? You're like, oh, hey, I like what he or she has to say. I'm going to start listening to them more, or subscribe to the whatever they're doing, follow them, whatever it may be. So yeah, it's tough in the beginning, but just getting your stuff out there, and social media is huge for that. And I think Twitter has been the best for our little niche corner of the internet. Obviously, Instagram is kind of different, and TikTok, those are better for other things. But that's kind of one thing I started doing. I never had a Twitter ever before. I just, and I'm not a big, I've never been a big social guy until I started getting into this. I've had a Facebook. I'm not on it too much. I don't do Instagram, TikTok, any of that. But when I started the writing, I'm like, all right, let me start a Twitter, just so I can tweet out my stuff and whatnot, and just interacting with people, and with jumping in, hobby and conversations, just being willing to answer questions and whatnot. And I just love it anyway. I love just talking ball all day. So it was easy for me to like answer a bunch of questions about prospects or rankings or strategy, this and that. So yeah, I think social media, it can be a drag sometimes. We all know there's days you're like, screw it, I don't want to be on social media today. I need a little mental reset. We all have that. Social media can get overwhelming at times, but it is important, because how else you gotta get your work out there? I mean, again, you're not going to be all of a sudden running for like Baseball America or ESPN, a big site right off the bat for the most part. So you're not going to be able to get your word out there from so many people being on that site. You might have to start at a smaller site, or just on your own, and get that word out there. So yeah, social media, I think, is really, really big for growth in this industry for sure.
When you talk about just the social media platforms in general, I think we're on the same page. I'm very much like you. X or Twitter is my go-to because I love baseball, and it does seem to be the best spot for our niche. I think you're absolutely correct with that. Do you think this transition in kind of the mainstream media and blue sky being propped up, do you think from your own perspective and like what you're doing to at times monetize the hobby, do you feel the pressure to be on blue sky, to be on threads for Instagram, or do you not necessarily care about that and are just happy to stay with your large following on X?
So I think for the most part, I'm happy to stay kind of where I am. I have done I did hop on Blue Sky a couple months ago. They're in that whole, the latest, everyone exodus from Twitter, but because it also helped that Blue Sky was the favorite one I've seen out of all the other
Mhm.
ones that were like, what was there? There was the Threads, which I'm like, I don't really like this. And there was what was that, Mastodon or some, I don't even remember what that was. I think it was called Mastodon. It was
Yeah, no, that was one. Yeah.
yeah, all these other ones are I'm like, I just don't like the platform, so I'm like, I didn't do it. But Blue Sky, I think, made it easier because it was made by the guy that originally made Twitter.
Yeah.
So I'm like, all right, this has a similar feel to it. So I can just, whenever I post something, I'll put it over there as well. But we tried, both Clegg and I, singly and for the podcast, tried, doing some of the other big ones that people are on, like, oh, let's do TikTok, but it never really materialized, and it's the amount of effort to put into like monetizing on YouTube is just it takes a long time, especially in our little niche corner. It's not really made for you might get a little bit, but it was like, all right, we're putting so much effort in and then not really getting much from it. So you kind of got to realize, all right, what's working for us? Twitter's working. Maybe we'll do a little bit elsewhere, but Twitter's again, it all comes back to what we're saying. Twitter, I found is the easiest and most usable for what we do. And yes, some people have left to go to other places, and that's fine. But you know, Twitter's always been there. I mean, who knows what's going to happen 10, 20 years down the road. But for now, it's like, all right, this is the best place for myself, for our podcast, and to grow our personal brand. So yeah, it's you think about the other ones, and then you're like, all right, what's actually working? Let's stick with that.
It's funny you bringing up TikTok. When I started my first podcast, which was just generalized sports conversation with one of my best friends, we grinded. I mean, we were 5, 6 clips a week, if not more. Zero traction for a long time. We had started just when the Just Baseball guys started, and 2020, you said it best, when everybody was like, "Let's start a podcast." Right? We'll
Yep.
buy the mic, get the gear, and we started to see our content take off, but it was negative content. It was, my buddy would clip something out from an hour and a half episode, and it might be a little bit more cringy, or it might be the shock value. And the biggest one we had was it's like 500,000 views, but it was me frustrated with Mike Trout's injury history. This is probably 3 years ago now, and I just came out and I said, like, the Mike Trout we love is gone. You look back in the last 3 years at that point, and I tracked it down. It was like he had played like 96 games on average. Here were his numbers. You could tell that the injuries were significant. And we had a really long conversation on it, but the 15-second clip he clipped out made me sound horrible. And people on TikTok loved it. I mean, they love to be toxic and they love to argue. But that was my moment where I realized like who I want to be in the industry, which is not somebody that is ever gaining notoriety for the shock value, because that's who you become then. Right. And
Mm.
Doc, I think you've done a good job with the personality aspect. You talked about the burner account and some of the unique characteristics that you've showed in some of the videos when you started doing this. There's a big difference between being charismatic and captivating and saying things that you don't believe in because you want a following. And I think that just gets to the moral integrity of what we all do. I think that is better in baseball than it is in generalized sports, though. Generalized sports, you do get caught up in that quite easily.
Man,
Yeah, but
the worst part about sorry to cut you off, man, but just like the worst part about any social media, any sports following that I find is actually like when you leave the fantasy world and you get into the home bases, like any kind of like Red Sox Twitter, Blue Jays Twitter, Yankees Twitter. It's like, and maybe some Twitters are better than others, but I just noticed that the way that fans talk to each other of the team is like so intense. Every fan in the league hates their team. but they love them so much, right? It's so crazy to see. Well, because sometimes they'll be intermingling when I talk about, like, I'll hashtag. Elon said don't use hashtags. I'm like, bro, I'm going to use them until they don't work. But they, yeah, it's just like you'll have some co-mingling. Whenever I get someone feisty at me, it's usually someone from like the actual team's fan base. And so they need to calm down a little bit. It's like the football thing when you're yelling at the TV, come on! Ah! It's like, at what point do you want to just like, hey, let's enjoy this life? And that's why I kind of like that. I'm not sure. I know you're a diehard Red Sox fan, if I'm correct, Eric.
Yep.
I'm not really a diehard. It's kind of like I'm in Indiana. I kind of just like middle America teams. There's a few I like more than others. I got to see Paul Skeens outduel Alek Manoah last year at AAA, which is great. But yeah, that was a privilege. And so yeah, that's where I'm at. Matt, you got any more of these? Like we're 44 minutes in, and I've talked to a lot of players.
We're gonna get into it. I promise. I have a problem with this. This has been
too quality of content. This is too high quality, too high brow for me.
All right. Well, let me finish it with our last question then before we move into players, because you just brought up a talking point that I actually don't have in our outline. But Eric, I really wanted to ask you about this because it's been on my mind for a few years, and it really goes into the Red Sox organization. I have always felt, not always, over the last couple of years, I've felt that there's a very high emphasis on projection within the Boston Red Sox organization. And I, for at least up until this year, didn't always see the same thing that the fan base did. And now it's hard because we're starting to see such an incredible development from this organization, right? From Meyer, Teal, Anthony, Luis Perales. I even liked Winkelman Gonzalez a lot. But my question for you is, how do you keep your fan base and your love for the Red Sox from making your opinions and maybe your scouting approach bias?
That's a good question, and it's funny too because I've been called a Red Sox, biased Red Sox fan and a Red Sox hater in the same hour, because I'll tell you if I like a player, I'll say it. If I don't like a player on my team, I'll also I was never a big Alex Verdugo guy, I'll say so. I was never a big, Henry Owens guy back in the day for one of our top prospects. So it is difficult because, obviously, even though I'll use Marcelo Meyer as an example, and I know Chris kind of has similar thoughts. We're not, neither one of us are like super high on Marcelo Meyer, at least compared to the industry. Like we think he's good, but we don't think he's like a stud. But like I want him to be a stud. Like I want Meyer to be an all-star shortstop. I want Campbell to be an all-star second baseman. I want Anthony to go out there and win some MVP awards. So I definitely want them all to succeed, even if I don't have them ranked as such. But I try to just get rid of any outside element and just look at the profile, look at, whether it be the video, look at the track record, look at some of the stats, look at some of the data. It's like, all right, do I like this, profile, this nameless, faceless, teamless profile? And it can be hard at times, but it makes it easier when, Anthony and Campbell are just studs anyway. So everyone ranks them highly now. But yeah, it's kind of, you got to strip it down a little bit and just, all right, do I like this profile? Yes, no, a little bit, a lot, and then kind of go from there. But yeah, I try to keep my bias out of it. Like I said, I've been very down on some Red Sox, major leaguers and prospects over the years. So yeah, I feel like I've found that good balance of, hey, I'll just tell it how it is. If that's always how I am, like kind of lose back to what we were saying earlier about, like being yourself, being genuine, and just having confidence in what you're saying. Like if you have a bold take, that's great. Don't just say bold things for the sake of saying bold things. But if you have a bold take that you believe in and you can back up, like, all right, this is why I think this way. This is why I said that. This is why I wrote that. That's great. If it's bold, and it probably doesn't work out, but it just confidence in what you're saying and being genuine to yourself goes a long way. But yeah, it's I try to just again not look at the Red Sox players, keep my bias out of it, and rank how I think they should be ranked.
I love that. I think what you just said is fantastic. Is taking the team context, the jersey off the back, and looking at the actual metrics, the actual body types, right? Like scouting them as if they did not have a team is fantastic. And Doc, I think you and I both, we have biases, right? Like I'm originally and will always be a Brewer fan, so I like Eric Batanti, I like Pratt, I like Made. it's hard to take that bias out, especially when you actually like the player if you take the jersey off, because you naturally want your teams to do well. And if you see something that you're like, hey, if he was a Red Sox or an Athletic or a Brewer, I would like him just the same. And having that ability to be unbiased, it's kind of crucial to do within, presenting your opinion. Doc, do you think you struggle with that at all? You like the Reds, or you like the Cardinals, you like the Royals, are there those teams that you at times find you may have ranked higher because you are a fan, or is it kind of like Eric said, more you've taken the jersey off and you still like what you see under the hood?
It's for me, it's like the trifecta of like the Cardinals, Royals, Rangers, just kind of like these kind of super middle America guys. Not going to do Houston. Houston's not middle America. They're in the Gulf of Mexico. The cheating thing made it weird. But anyway, yeah, I mean, they all have their own charm, but I mean, I'm like the low guy on Sebastian Walcott. And people get mad at me sometimes, and I say, listen, I hope it works out. Kind of like the Rangers. Like I was jumping for joy when they were hitting home runs in the World Series. I'm a huge Evan Carter guy, but yeah, I'm going to call it how I see it. What I would say is that a bias for anyone will leak out in a good way. It's kind of just a natural, organic way in that. And when I say bias, I don't actually mean bias. I mean, you're going to be watching and following a team more.
Yep.
So you're more likely to find low key studs, or you're going to be I'm from Indiana. Max Clark was playing down the street from me last year in high school. So I went to go see him. Obviously, I'm like, okay, this is great, and then I get to see Max Clark talk. He's super intelligent, So I would say I was on to Max Clark, and I was plugged into Max Clark coming out of the draft more than maybe some people would be. Not every scout, obviously. I just saw one game, but I'm like, he's on my mind more. So maybe Eric has he's been following the lower level Red Sox guys. I personally think I'm following the Royals guys more, and I think that Royals prospects they're just good for value because nobody wants them. So I can get them wherever I want for free or nothing, basically. Noah Cameron is still basically cheap. Try not to get into him. I got to do it with Cross, and Cross is like, Clegg, and he was saying, Cameron's a guy. I'm like, yeah, no one seems to care. He's a guy. Anyway, so I would just say that, no, I keep it. I certainly have my hot leads because of these teams that I'm around, like more so than maybe the East Coast and West Coast teams that the media will talk more about. But hey, the nice thing about that is the media will just talk about them anyway. I'll figure it out.
All right. It was awesome to have Eric on today. We really appreciate him spending time. Remember, you can follow him and his podcast and the work he does at Patreon, on X, as well as the ToolShed podcast. But I'll turn it over to Doc to say goodbye.
Yeah, for the first time in a while, you might be able to hear this more clearly than ever before. I'm your Huckleberry.
We will catch you guys next week.